On this episode, we're talking about leading with authenticity. Hey everybody, and welcome to episode 9 of the vlog. All right, so I am here today with a really great friend of mine by the name of Kathy Ock. She is the president of Learning Paradigms. She's a thought leader in the area of organizational design, organizational effectiveness, but most importantly, she is great with people. And Kathy and I have a very special relationship in that we've not only worked professionally, but she's also been a tremendous mentor of mine, specifically because we share the common interest in connection. So Kathy, talk a little bit about yourself, introduce yourself, and your ties to this concept of connection and this concept of developing people.
I have known Anthony now, I guess, for almost 7 years, maybe even a little bit longer than that. I worked in the corporate world for almost 20 years and then went independent in 2000, so I've been on my own since for 17 years, and I practice in 3 key areas. I focus on working with people in planning their strategies for the future, in developing the leadership talent on their team, and in helping them manage challenges and changes that are going on within and across the organization. The commonality for all 3 of these is that I'm always working with people every single day in what I do. And what is fascinating about the work that I'm engaged in is that I am always also working at the intersection of strategy, leadership, and change. So I'm very focused on how these 3 things come together. And if you think of those as 3 overlapping circles, at the very center, the shared center for all of them is people. People is really the common denominator. And people are fascinating. I have a psychology background. I've studied people for 30 years, and I am always intrigued by the choices people make. And I focus the majority of my time really on helping people be as successful as they can be, sometimes tapping into potential that they don't even know is really there.
That's great. There is an intangible component to Kathy's practice, and that is the way that she works one-on-one with leaders in the industry. And I've been fortunate enough to not only collaborate with Kathy on certain projects, but I've also been a student of her coaching, and I can tell you there's a part of her practice where when she gets in a room, she's able to establish a connection and a rapport with people unlike any other, and that rapport builds over time. And so today we're going to talk a little bit about some of those intangible qualities that allow Kathy not only to open the space for connecting people, but also to make room for personal development while we're in our workplace. Because as we know, the way that we develop ourselves professionally is oftentimes super different than the way that we develop ourselves personally. Mm-hmm. And there are some concepts that we would love to talk about today that I'm fascinated with that allow us to bridge the gap between personal development and professional development. Okay, so we're talking today about this concept of emotional intelligence and some of the more intangible traits to becoming a leader and being able to develop yourself both personally and professionally. Let's really go into the professional space, because EQ, or emotional intelligence, is a term that's it's starting to be used a lot more. Talk to us a little bit about EQ and maybe some of the more common literature around this term in the corporate space.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think one of the key thought leaders in the EQ field is Daniel Goleman. He's done a tremendous amount of research and actually has written several critical books on this topic that I think help us understand to a much greater extent what EQ really is. EQ, I would say, has become much more prominent over the last 10 to 15 years because for so long we focused on people's IQ and what they were able to do in role in terms of their technical expertise and their actual knowledge base and the way that they were able to bring that intellectual capacity to their performance. The reality is that every role today almost every role involves interacting with people on a very regular basis, and IQ is no longer really sufficient. We have to understand how to manage our own emotions first, how to identify them and manage them, and then also how to interact with other people and manage their emotions.
This gets into a topic that I absolutely love and has been a big part of my professional, personal growth over the last couple of years, which is self-awareness. The ability to not only know what you're great at, go all in on that, but also know how to manage the way that you're navigating big decisions or pivot points in your career. and being able to handle both the objective and the softer side of these decisions in the way that you're interacting with others.
I think that's especially important in the work that I do as well, because I do a lot of consulting, but I also do a lot of coaching, executive coaching with people at mid and senior levels in organizations. And I always try and remind myself that when people come into an engagement with me, that I'm always dealing with the whole person. And the whole person is personal and professional. You know, the line is not as solid anymore between those two dimensions of people's worlds. And the reality is you have to really coach the whole individual. I work much more with leaders now in the area of their authenticity, helping them think about and figure out how to bring their whole self to everything they do, because that's going to give them the greatest opportunity for impact.
All right, so Kathy, you just touched on a term that I think is super fascinating, and that is the term authenticity. Now, as you start to unpack emotional intelligence, or EQ, you start to get into certain concepts that people maybe aren't terribly comfortable talking about in the workplace. You talk about becoming your most authentic self. What does that mean?
I would say that I have learned a significant amount about authenticity from a wonderful researcher, writer, and practitioner. Her name is Dr. Brene Brown. About a year and a half ago, I participated in a national training program that she invited practitioners to, certified coaches and licensed therapists. And I went through a 5-day experience in really learning her work around authenticity and what she calls wholehearted living. And what I love about Brene's work is that she says so much about authenticity and the link to what gets in our way of truly being authentic. And we have to be able to look at the things that get in our way, because if we don't deal with those things, then we won't be able to bring our full self to everything we do. So we went into things like trust and empathy and compassion, but we also delved into areas like vulnerability and shame resilience. And what's so fascinating about it is that if we are able to explore those areas and really uncover the things that potentially compromise our authenticity, we can overcome those and be a much better version of ourselves.
So many of us have probably seen, and if you haven't, definitely go check out the 2010 TED Talk that Dr. Brene Brown did. This is really what put her on the map, and really started to introduce the broader population to the concept of vulnerability. The 2010 talk on TED is just fascinating. It was an absolute life changer for me in terms of starting to feel comfortable bringing in these concepts of vulnerability and starting to really understand what it takes to show up as your true authentic self. And as Kathy mentioned, for me, that was more of a personal journey that became and started to permeate into my professional world. These are concepts that you can't just hand out in a book or a pamphlet and ask people to learn it and report back. These are concepts that you truly do need to create an environment that is conducive to opening up to these concepts. And that is essentially what Kathy does, and she does it extremely well. So, Kathy, why don't you talk a little bit about some of the workshops that you do and how we can start to practice this concept of self-awareness, vulnerability, and showing up as our true, authentic self.
What we've tried to do is to make a space available to people that is a safe space where they can let down their guard a bit and they can explore some things and investigate further what it would look like to tell their story in a more daring way. A lot of Brene's work is about courage and the link between courage and vulnerability. And she says vulnerability really is our truest test of courage. And I have come to believe that completely in the work that I've done myself. And we're trying to offer that same opportunity now to other people through the experiences that we create. Maybe we should each give an example of how we have been able to bring more vulnerability into our own lives. I know.
Exactly the reaction, right? That you often get with people when you bring this concept up of vulnerability. It's like, like maybe we should share, maybe we should open up, and you immediately get that reaction of like, oof.
I know.
Why don't we talk a little bit about, Kathy? I mean, you've been in a lot of different corporate environments. You've worked with a lot of client organizations in bringing some of these concepts in to help them become more of a high-performing team. So how do we create that space?
It's been so interesting through the work that I've been doing in Brene Brown's methodology to pull some of that out and start to infuse that in some of the corporate groups that I've been working with has been incredibly powerful. And one group that I worked with last year, they were coming together. There were 12 people. They were attempting to form a new extended leadership team for their business unit. Many of them had relationships with each other that they had established previously, but they didn't have a deep connection across the team. And one of the things we did was we sent them in advance the article that Google released about the research they'd done on high-performing teams. And in that research, after interviewing 180 different teams, they discovered that there were 5 key drivers of high performance. The number one driver was psychological safety, and they defined that as people being in relationships where they're willing to be vulnerable and take risks with one another. So we teed that up ahead of time and also sent them another article that was about the difference between common trust, which exists in everyday relationships, and vulnerability-based trust, which is what characterizes high-performing teams. The combination of those two then set us up to request that people think about a story of struggle that they would be willing to share in their extended group meeting. So they met for the first time, and I facilitated an exercise where they were able to define the safety of the space that they were in and how they would achieve that safety with each other. And once we created that space, then they each had an opportunity to share their story of struggle. It was so powerful and really amazing to see what it did to one another in the group, each of the people, for them to understand where the different people were coming from and what their stories were, because they'd never heard these stories before, even though they'd worked with people for quite a long time. That set the stage then for us to ultimately create a new set of norms for this team. So they approached that experience with a very different sense of transparency with one another and a willingness to be vulnerable and to say things that previously might have been off the table or in a more guarded space probably wouldn't have emerged. So what I'm finding is that it does afford people a much deeper connection and a way forward that they have not had access to previously.
Well, I will tell you, there is nobody better at bringing these concepts into the corporate space, into the group setting than Kathy. And Kathy, I just thank you so much for not only the work that you do in the community, but also the work that we've done together. It has absolutely been the gateway for me in terms of my professional growth, making the tough decisions to continue to follow my passions and do that in the most authentic way that I possibly can. So Kathy, thank you so much. I will put a couple links in terms of some of the resources that we referenced throughout the episode in the description of the video below. Kathy herself is offering some of these experiences over the next couple months. Kathy, why don't you talk to the folks about how they can get involved?
We have a program that's coming up in April. Actually, it's going to be at the end of this week. It's called Soulful Living. That is a program that my business partner, Kathy Russi, and I created that offers people the opportunity to come together and clarify their values, identify their unique gifts, and then explore their areas of passion. So they bring that all together in a life purpose statement and really figure out how they want to make a difference in the world. It's a very exciting opportunity for people to come together in community, support one another, and come out with something very tangible and very directionally sound. And I've seen the transformative effect of that experience on people. We also offer a program called Daring Way, which is based on Brene Brown's work, not only her research, but also many of her practices. Another very exciting opportunity. We are doing that one in the middle of May, the 11th through the 13th. That's being done in Glenview, Illinois. And that really affords people the opportunity to see trust and empathy and compassion and vulnerability and shame, as well as shame resilience, in the context of human connection. So it's really about diving deeper into these areas that have been, I think, difficult for people to really wrap their arms around. It gives people the language and the understanding of what these mean and how to bring them more fully into their own relationships. And again, another very transformative experience. So thank you for the opportunity. It has been such a pleasure working with Anthony, and also discovering some things about myself in the process of trying to mentor him and being willing to share some of my own vulnerability in that process.
That's great. We definitely grow together, and I wouldn't change a thing about that in terms of our partnership. So thank you, Kathy.
Thank you.
That was so good. You get to that point, you get to like a certain flow.
Yeah.
I think it was after you and I just started kind of talking casually, and then you get in the flow, and it's like we could sit here for hours.
You don't even pay attention to the
camera.
camera.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.